It started like any other quiet morning in the mountains. The air was crisp, the kind of fresh, pine-scented air that city people pay money just to breathe for a weekend. My mansion stood proudly on the edge of the ridge, carved into the mountainside like a king's fortress. Wide timber beams, stone walls, glass panels stretching floor to ceiling. This wasn't just a house. It was my dream, the product of years of backbreaking work, sacrifice, and vision. I remember standing on the balcony that morning, sipping my coffee as the sun rose over the Rockies. The valley below glowed with golden light. Birds chirped. The world felt still and peaceful. But peace can be deceptive. Sometimes the worst storms don't announce themselves with thunder. They creep in quietly, then strike without warning. And that was the moment I heard it, a low, mechanical rumble echoing from the winding road below. At first, I thought maybe it was just a delivery truck, or maybe the county doing road work. But the sound grew louder, heavier. I leaned over the railing and froze. 2 bulldozers, a dump truck, and a convoy of SUVs crawling up my private road like an invading army. My stomach dropped. Something about the way they moved, the determination in their slow advance, told me this wasn't an accident. These machines weren't here for road repairs. They were here for me. I rushed down the steps, heart pounding, nearly spilling my coffee on the floor. By the time I flung open the front doors, they were already in my driveway. The bulldozers' engines roared, spewing black smoke into the mountain air. Men in hard hats jumped down, clipboards in hand, while a group of sharply dressed people, suits, ties, sunglasses, stood behind them with folded arms. At the front of the group was a man I recognized all too well. Richard Hayes, president of the local HOA. Tall, balding, smug as ever, he adjusted his silk tie like he owned the world. What the hell is going on? I shouted, my voice echoing through the valley. Richard gave me a smile that wasn't really a smile, more like a sneer. Mr. Carter, he said smoothly, we've come to collect on your unpaid community fees. My jaw clenched. Unpaid? Are you insane? I don't even live in your community. My property is outside your district lines. He shrugged like it didn't matter. Paperwork says otherwise. You've ignored our letters, so now we're forced to take action. Before I could process what he meant, the bulldozers roared to life. One of them rolled forward, its massive steel blade gleaming in the morning sun. I stepped in front of it, waving my arms. You touched this house, and I swear. But the operator didn't stop. The machine inched closer, pressing me back until I had no choice but to move aside. The blade slammed into the stone wall of my garage with a sickening crunch. The sound of splintering wood and crumbling rock ripped through the air. I felt like I was watching my own body being torn apart. Every strike of that bulldozer was a strike to my heart. Stop. You can't do this. I screamed, but my words were drowned out by the grinding metal and the crashing of debris. The suited HOA board members stood in a neat little line, arms crossed, their expressions cold and satisfied, like vultures watching a carcass get picked apart. Richard lit a cigar of all things and puffed the smoke into the air. This is what happens, he called over the noise, when people think they're above the rules. Above the rules? I had followed every rule, paid every bill, filed every permit. This was my land, bought fair and square, surveyed and recorded with the county. But none of that mattered to them. They weren't here for justice. They were here for power. The bulldozer smashed through the garage wall completely, exposing my workshop. My tools clattered to the floor. A framed photo of my late father, who had helped me lay the first foundation stones of this house, fell face first into the dirt. My chest tightened as tears stung my eyes. I ran to the workers, shoving one of their clipboards back into his chest. Where's the court order? Where's the sheriff? You can't do this without proper authority. But the man just avoided my gaze. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to get paid. And so, like some nightmare playing out in broad daylight, I stood powerless as my dream collapsed before me. Walls cracked, beams splintered, windows shattered into glittering dust. By sunset, the mansion that had once stood tall and proud was reduced to rubble. A pile of wood, stone, and glass, nothing more. When the last bulldozer pulled back, silence fell across the mountain. The HOA agents gathered their papers, shook hands, and drove away as casually as if they had just finished a day at the office. Richard was the last to leave. He glanced back at me one final time, smirked and muttered, "Next time, pay your fees." Then he slid into his black SUV and disappeared down the road. I was left standing in the ruins of my life. The sky turned purple as night crept over the mountains. I sat down on a broken beam, staring up at the stars. My heart was heavy, my hands trembling, but inside me, something else began to burn, hotter than grief, stronger than fear. Rage. They thought they had won. They thought I was beaten, broken, powerless. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. That night, I swore on the ruins of my mansion that I would not rest until the HOA that destroyed me was erased, not just from my life, but from the state map itself. And that vow was the beginning of their end. When the last bulldozer left my property that evening, I stood among the ruins like a man who had lost everything. The smell of dust and diesel still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of pine from the surrounding forest. My mountain mansion, my pride, my sanctuary, was now nothing but a pile of broken timber, shattered glass, and crushed stone. I remember crouching down, my hands brushing through the debris. My fingertips touched the jagged edges of what was once my dining table, carved from a single slab of redwood. I found scraps of insulation fluttering like feathers in the wind. My father's photo, the one that had fallen earlier, now lay bent and scratched. I picked it up and wiped the dust off his face, and that was a moment I felt something break inside me. I wasn't just heartbroken. I was furious. All my life, I had believed in building things, not destroying them. I had worked construction in my younger years, saving every dime to one day build the kind of home people only dream about. I believed in law, in fairness, in doing things the right way. And yet, in a single day, a smug HOA and their bulldozers had wiped out a lifetime of sacrifice. I shouted into the empty mountain air, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the cliffs and came back to me like a mockery. I wasn't shouting at the world. I was shouting at myself. How had I let this happen? How had I been so powerless? But anger is a strange thing. At first, it crushes you. Then, if you let it simmer long enough, it transforms into something sharper, stronger. And that night, as the stars came out and the mountain grew quiet again, my anger hardened into resolve. I replayed the scene in my head 100 times. Richard Hayes standing there with that smug look, puffing a cigar, telling me I wasn't above the rules. His words burned in my brain. This is what happens when you ignore us. Ignore them? I had answered their letters, disputed their bogus claims, even hired an attorney who told me I wasn't under their jurisdiction. But they didn't care. They thought intimidation and destruction would silence me. They thought fear would keep me in line. They were wrong. Sitting in the rubble, I felt like a soldier after a battle. My home was gone, but I wasn't. They had destroyed the walls around me, but they hadn't destroyed the fire inside me. And in that moment, I realized something. My mansion wasn't my greatest creation. My fight was about to be. I walked through what was left of my property that night with a flashlight. Every shattered beam, every ruined brick, every broken window. I memorized it all because this wasn't just damage. It was evidence. Evidence of what they had done illegally, without a court order, without proper jurisdiction. The HOA wanted me to feel small, powerless, and defeated. But what they had really done was give me the perfect reason to fight back with everything I had. I knew I couldn't just storm into their office and demand justice. That's what they expected. Anger, outbursts, maybe even violence. No, if I wanted to truly bring them down, I had to be smarter. I had to hit them where it hurt most. Their power, their money, and their lies. As I sat on the broken stone steps of what used to be my front porch, a plan began to form. I had skills they didn't know about. I wasn't just a homeowner. I had once been a licensed land surveyor and worked as a contractor for government infrastructure projects. I understood land boundaries, property laws, and loopholes in zoning better than most people ever would. The HOA thought they could bend the rules to suit themselves. But I knew how to expose them, and I knew the law better than they realized. By the time the first light of dawn spilled over the mountain peaks, my grief had shifted completely into determination. My home was gone, but in its place stood a new mission. I would not just rebuild, I would retaliate. And this wouldn't be petty revenge. This would be complete and total destruction of the HOA that had crossed me. I imagined Richard Hayes sitting in his cushy boardroom chair, barking orders, thinking he had won. He had no idea that his victory over me was the very spark that would ignite his downfall. They had taken my house. I would take their entire district. That's the thing about breaking points. People think it's the end. They think when you snap, you collapse. But sometimes when a man reaches his breaking point, he doesn't break down. He breaks open. And what comes out is stronger, more dangerous, and unstoppable. I wasn't the same man I had been yesterday. Yesterday, I was a homeowner. Today, I was a storm waiting to be unleashed. As I looked out over the valley, the morning sun casting fire over the mountains, I whisper a vow to myself, to my father's memory, and to the ruins beneath my feet. They destroyed my home. Now I'll destroy their empire. That was the moment my war with the HOA truly began. They thought I'd crumble. Instead, I sharpened myself like a tool. The morning after the demolition, while the neighborhood still buzzed with gossip and thin sympathy, I packed a battered legal folder, my old surveyor's kit, and a camera. If they'd come to destroy without right, then I would build a case that left no room for their lies. First step, evidence. I walked every inch of my property, photographing damage, taking GPS points, and cataloging broken items. I recorded the skid marks on my driveway, the dents in the garage door, the crushed foundation stones. Everything that bore the fingerprints of their machines became a numbered exhibit. I spoke to neighbors who'd watched the convoy come up the road. Old Mrs. Delaney across the ridge had sat on her porch with binoculars. Her statement about the board's armored SUVs arriving without any sheriff escort would matter later. A kid on a dirt bike had filmed part of the demolition. His shaky phone footage showed the moment the operator shoved a blade through my father's photo. That clip became Exhibit B. But physical evidence alone wouldn't topple an organization that had behind bylaws and bogus paperwork. That's when I shifted into surveyor mode. I pulled my old plats and county records, the same dusty documents I had used years ago to mark property lines. Richard Hayes had been confident he could claim jurisdiction because his HOA's recorded map looked, on paper, legitimate. What he didn't realize was that maps are built from facts, and facts can be checked. I started comparing copies, the HOA's recorded plat versus the county's master records. Differences appeared like small inconsistencies at first. A fence line misplaced, a meets and bounds description with misstated bearing. But as I traced the coordinates, the picture sharpened. The HOA's district line crossed parcels it had no legal claim over. Several parcels, including mine, had been included by a clerical tweak the HOA secretary had filed 2 years earlier. A tweak that, in legal terms, didn't meet the standards or annexation. That was the crack I needed. Next, I dug into finances. Public filings revealed HOA assessments collected from dozens of addresses that, by record, were outside the district's legitimate boundary. I photocopied bank statements, cross-referenced deposit dates, and highlighted sums that didn't reconcile with approved budgets. A pattern emerged. Fees siphoned from properties that should never have been charged, routed through a shell account managed by a local management company with ties to several board members. Fraud wasn't theory anymore. It was visible math. I also started quietly interviewing people who'd been quietly pushed around. A handyman who'd been threatened with fines for fixing a neighbor's fence. A retired surveyor who'd been paid off to sign an opinion about boundaries years back. Even a former HOA board member who'd left midterm and now confessed she felt uneasy about the bookkeeping. I recorded their testimonies, with permission, legally and plainly, and documented inconsistencies between what the HOA claimed in meetings and what showed up in county filings. With a binder that resembled a small case file, I did something the HOA leaders hadn't expected. I walked into the state attorney general's office. I laid everything on the table. The photos, the GPS logs, the neighbor statements, the bank anomalies, and the county records showing the legal annexation. I explained, calmly and precisely, how the demolition had occurred without proper court orders, and how fee collection had been systematically illegal. IT didn't feel like a victory at first. State attorneys are busy people. I had to sit through an assistant's slow intake process, answer questions, and wait. But patience was part of the plan. I knew a strong, well-documented file would move people who otherwise ignored a lone homeowner's cries. While the state examined the evidence, I kept building pressure in other lawful ways. I filed formal complaints with the county clerk about the HOA's annexation filings. I posted my evidence on a public forum for local property owners, carefully avoiding libel, just facts, documents, and photos. I spoke to a small local reporter who loved the David versus Goliath story. The paper ran a short piece that made the board jittery. Calls started coming in at odd hours, not to me, but to the HOA office. Questions, requests for documents. The eyes that had watched me from their SUVs were now looking over their own shoulders. Throughout it all, I kept my temper. If the HOA expected me to lash out, they were disappointed. I let the evidence do the shouting. Their confidence had been arrogance. Arrogance dies easily when confronted with paper, law, and witnesses. The day the state called me back, their voice was different, formal, careful, and sharp. An investigator would come out. They wanted to see the site, review the exhibits, and hear sworn testimony. The machinery of justice had begun to turn. Standing at the wreckage that morning, watching an official car pull up the road, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. I had turned my grief into discipline, my fury into process. The HOA had taken my home, but in doing so they'd expose themselves. Now the law would do what the bulldozers would not. It would dismantle them piece by piece, with proofs and procedures. As the investigator climbed out and took his first notes, I locked eyes with him and quietly said, "You don't know how many people they hurt." He nodded as if he already did. I felt something lift off my shoulders. This was no longer just about me. It was about stopping a system that preyed on people who trusted their community. The war had shifted. I had stopped being the hunted. From that moment on, I was the one hunting. When an investigator from the state stepped onto my property, something that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over. His notepad was small, his voice calm, but the look in his eyes told me this was no routine complaint. He asked questions I prepared for, dates, names, exhibit numbers, and nodded as I handed over folders that looked more like a prosecutor's brief than a homeowner's scrapbook. That nod was the sound of legitimacy. It meant the paper trail I'd built could actually move mountains. Within days, the state's team had a formal notice on the HOA's desk. It was clinical and devastating. Subpoenas, asset freezes, and an order to preserve all records. Suddenly, the people who had strutted up my driveway in their Sunday best were scrambling. The board members who'd once smiled for photos stopped returning calls. Their management company lawyers sent a terse letter promising cooperation, but the tone was frantic now, not smug. The first real strike came quietly. The bank accounts the HOA used to collect fees were frozen under a court order. For an organization that ran on collections and assessments, it was like cutting off oxygen. The management company's phone lines lit up with panicked staff asking how payroll would be handled. Without access to funds, contractors stopped showing up at the HOA's properties. Suddenly, the board's ability to flex power was limited to empty threats. Then the criminal investigations began. The prosecutor charged several board members with fraud and extortion, serious allegations that brought a new level of attention. Richard Hayes, their president and my face of evil for so long, found himself photographed not as a man of authority, but in the cold fluorescence of a booking room. He denied everything, of course, but denials mean less when subpoenas, bank records, and sworn statements point the other way. The state didn't stop at criminal charges. They also took a scalpel to the HOA's jurisdiction. Using precise survey evidence I'd given them, and pulling independent records, the state re-examined the HOA's annexation filings. Where the HOA had relied on sloppy paperwork and a couple of manipulated plats, the state had deeds, GPS coordinates, and testimony. The result was surgical. Large swaths of land the HOA claimed were legally decertified from its district. In bureaucratic terms, it was a redraw. In practical terms, it was a public erasure. The map the HOA had used to collect fees was effectively scrubbed. When the official redrawn maps were published, it felt surreal. I sat at my kitchen table, what was left of it, and watched the new district outlines appear on the county website. My property and dozens like it were no longer inside that HOA's boundaries. All those assessments they'd been charging? Illegitimate. The state ordered refunds where possible and directed the county to notify impacted homeowners. But the legal hammer had more teeth. The state also sought restitution for the illegal demolition. The bulldozers were seized as evidence. Contractors who'd worked on the operation were subpoenaed. Some swapped Bland and Niles for plea deals when confronted with documents. Board members faced not just fines, but the possibility of jail time. Insurance claims the HOA had tried to use to cover its legal exposure were examined and, in some cases, denied due to the fraudulent nature of the actions. Public exposure was part of the downfall as well. Local news ran the story widely. Social media amplified it. People who had felt powerless finally had a narrative to rally around. Neighbors came forward with more testimonies. Previously hidden details spilled out, and the county launched its own administrative review into how such abuse could happen. The HOA's brand was ruined. Meetings that had once been perfunctory and boring now drew packed rooms of angry residents demanding accountability. The human drama was messy. Some board members resigned and tried to fade into anonymity. Others fought tooth and nail, hiring attorneys and shouting about due process. The management firm that had handled their money severed ties, trying to salvage what business they could. Through it all, I kept my focus on two things: documentation and community. I continued to work with the prosecutor, provide affidavits, and help neighbors file refund claims. I also met with other homeowners, helping them understand the new maps and the process to reclaim their rights. Rebuilding from the damage was a separate, long road. The state's restitution orders helped but didn't replace memories or the craftsmanship of what was lost. Some neighbors pooled resources to stabilize what remained of my property and prevent further vandalism. Others volunteered to guard the site against opportunistic looters. The community that had once turned a blind eye slowly shifted into a group committed to oversight and transparency. That'd be why the time courts issued their final judgments. The HOA as it had existed was gone. Officials dissolved the board, appointed a state monitor to oversee remaining matters, and in a public hearing the county rescinded the HOA's ability to collect back assessments. For the people who had built that little empire on intimidation and sketchy paperwork, the consequences were severe: fines, restitution orders, and in at least one case, a criminal sentence. Standing at the edge of the cleared lot months later, watching crews catalog what could be salvaged, I felt a complicated peace. The vindication wasn't the point. Not really. It was about preventing this from happening again. The HOA had fallen because its power was illegitimate, and the community reclaimed control by insisting on facts, records, and law. They'd thought they could bulldoze me into silence. Instead, their fall was a blueprint. Proof that when abuse is documented and exposed, systems that seem immovable can be dismantled. The mountain may have taken my house, but it couldn't bury the truth. People often ask me if I ever got over the loss of my mansion. The truth? You don't get over something like that. A home isn't just wood and stone. It's the years you put into building it, the memories etched into the walls, the late nights spent working so you can afford it, the loved ones who help you shape it. My father and I laid the first foundation stones together, and I'd imagined raising my own family there someday. Watching bulldozers tear it down in a single afternoon felt like watching a piece of myself die. But here's what I learned. Sometimes what gets destroyed on the outside builds something unshakable on the inside. The HOA thought they had silenced me, broken me, humiliated me. What they didn't realize was that they'd awakened a determination far stronger than their bulldozers, their bylaws, or their intimidation. Yes, I lost my house, but I gained something greater, a cause. When the state finally dissolved their HOA district, neighbors began reaching out to me. People I had never spoken to suddenly wanted to share their stories. A single mother told me how the HOA threatened to fine her for putting up a wooden playset in her backyard. An elderly couple revealed that they had paid thousands in special assessments for community improvements that never happened. One man confided that he had nearly lost his home after the HOA claimed his roof shingles violated community standards and slapped him with daily penalties. My fight had started as a personal war. But listening to these people, I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. HOAs were supposed to protect property values, maintain order, and build communities. But too often, they became bullies hiding behind paperwork. My story became a symbol for anyone who had ever felt small in front of an overreaching board. And here's my message to every homeowner who's dealing with an HOA nightmare. Don't let them scare you into silence. Don't let their letters and fines make you think you're powerless. You have rights. You have a voice. And if you're willing to put in the work, you can fight back, not with fists, but with facts. The HOA that destroyed my mansion had all the confidence in the world. They thought they were untouchable. They thought no one would dare challenge them. But all it took was one person, one binder full of evidence, one homeowner who refused to bow down, to bring their empire crashing down. That's what I want people to remember. You don't need to be a lawyer or a politician to stand up to abuse. You just need persistence, patience, and the courage to keep pushing even when it feels hopeless. I won't lie to you. The fight won't be easy. There will be nights when you'll feel like giving up, when you'll sit among the rubble of what they've taken from you and wonder if it's worth it. But I promise you, the moment you stand your ground, the moment you decide that enough is enough, you've already begun to win. And here's something else I come to realize. HOAs thrive on fear. They rely on the idea that homeowners will pay fines without asking questions, that people will accept rules without challenging them. But when you shine a light on their actions, when you force transparency, their power evaporates. My story isn't unique. It's just louder because the HOA was reckless enough to bulldoze my house. But every unjust fine, every illegal lien, every unfair rule is a crack in the foundation of their authority. And cracks always spread. To this day, I still walk the cleared lot where my mansion once stood. The walls are gone, the windows shattered, the roof collapsed. But when I stand there, I don't feel beaten anymore. I feel stronger. Because while they erased my house, I erased their entire district from the state map. Think about that. One house for an entire empire. That's a trade I'll take every time. So if you're listening to this right now, and you're going through something similar, remember my story. Remember that no HOA, no matter how powerful they seem, is above the law. And remember that even if they bulldoze your walls, they can't bulldoze your will to fight. This is Try Next HOA Stories, and my promise to you is this. I'll keep telling these stories, because the more we share, the stronger we become. And maybe, just maybe, the next time an HOA thinks about overstepping its bounds, they'll remember what happened here in the Rockies, and think twice before bringing their bulldozers. Because if they don't, well, they already know what happens when they underestimate the people they're supposed to serve.